Laura Bohannan's article, Shakespeare in the Bush, which can be used for many purposes in anthropology. It could be used as a kind of general introduction to what anthropologists did. It's like kind of it's getting to be a rather old article now, probably needs a new title, but this is about 50 years ago, 55 years ago, that it was first published by the anthropologist Laura Bohannan, who did most of her own field work in the 1950s among the Tiv of Nigeria. And we're using it in this class to talk about the difficulties of field work. It tells us about how field work was done and what it's like to be there, not understand what's going on, and to try and trying to figure out what is going on. But it's also a way of transitioning into the next class where we'll be talking about issues of language and interpretation. There's a lot of Bohannan was very interested in issues of how different words and concepts are interpreted and translated between languages, and what it really meant to learn a language. And this article is, I think, the second most read article outside of anthropology. The first is an article called Body Ritual Among the Naki Rema, which I think I might give you for your exam essay. But this one is probably one of the ones that has been used both in lots of different anthropology classes and outside of anthropology. And I was somewhat interested. I found this time around, I found that it has actually also been translated into at least Spanish. So we have the translation of Shakespeare from Laura Bohannan into the Tiv, but now we have the translation of that into Spanish, which would be an interesting exercise to see how it means in another language entirely. So we start off with Bohannan going out, about to leave for the field, and she is at Oxford. Bohannan was kind of an interesting person in that she grew up in the United States, but studied in England at Oxford before she did her anthropology. So it was in some ways more oriented toward the way anthropology was done in the UK than here. Eventually it would come back to the United States. But what does she believe? What does she believe about Shakespeare and about human nature before she goes to the field, before she even tells this story? She starts having an argument with somebody, her friend and colleague there. What does she believe about Shakespeare? Yeah, okay.
Not necessarily Shakespeare, but just like great tragedies like that are universally understandable.
Universally understandable, the great tragedies. And I think that she's arguing with her friend, right, that Shakespeare is universal. It's going to be, you can change the terms around a little bit, but everyone will understand it. And she actually declares that human nature is pretty much the same the whole world over. Now, interestingly, at the very beginning, well, Delaney, you said this was all an argument to prove a point to her friend. What does her friend argue back? Or what's the...
Yeah, if I'm remembering correctly, it was kind of like only like the English can understand this perfect form or something like that.
Only the English can understand Shakespeare. Yeah, sort of. I mean, her English friend or English colleague says that now this is not a universal thing. This is not something that everyone. I think he was probably saying, I forget if it was a he or she or somebody, they were probably saying that the way you do the way you Americans read Shakespeare is you make it into this big universal thing. But actually, if you really want to understand Shakespeare, you really have to understand the English society at the time. And so that's what the English colleague is saying, is that Shakespeare was a very English poet, and one can easily misinterpret the universal by misunderstanding the particular. So I don't think the colleague was necessarily saying that only the English could understand Shakespeare, but you had to understand the particularities of the English in order to understand Shakespeare correctly. And if so, you wouldn't be all claiming that it was a misinterpretation of universal themes or human nature all over the place. So it starts off with this interesting argument between two English speakers, or as it's sometimes called, two countries that are separated by a common language. Bohannan goes off and gets her chance to prove her point, is reading Hamlet in the field, and they make her tell the stories during the drinking times. So it probably helps if you read Hamlet recently, say in senior year of high school, but if you've seen The Lion King, it's close enough. At least my kids say so. But Hamlet begins with a scene in which there's a ghost, right? And she immediately runs into difficulties there. Alex, what's the problem with the ghost? You don't believe in ghosts. The ghosts aren't real. Yeah, they have different ideas, and she says that other groups in the area would know what that meant. But in this group, there is no individual personality after death. So it's a little bit different than not believing in ghosts. Like, I don't believe in ghosts, but I understand the idea of a ghost. Like, I understand that people would believe, and every so often I'd be tempted to believe too, that you continue to have your individual personality after you die. Like, that's a concept that is probably familiar to us, but they would not have that concept. That doesn't mean that they don't have other concepts about life or what happens after people die, and they might be complex and interesting on their own, but they can't understand this idea that someone would come back as an individual personality after death. So that throws her for a little bit, just the term the term ghost. One of the other things that Hamlet wrestles with here is that when his father is killed, his mother remarries too fast, he says. She's getting married too fast. What do they say about that problem? Yeah. That's what you're supposed to do, right? They're like, yeah, that's a good idea. And in fact, you should do that. You should marry your brother's wife, because that's the custom. For those of you who are way up on your Bible, this comes up in when Jesus is talking to the Pharisees, and they ask him about a woman who marries 7 brothers in succession. So this is actually it's a custom called the levirate, which is that if you are a woman who is married to one man, and that husband dies, the next person would be the brother. That's a good idea because it keeps things in the family. And of course, similarly, we have in the particular English context the idea of monogamy, whereas they are arguing that, hey, the king should have a lot of wives in order to do all the labor and stuff that is required of being a king. So this is throwing Bohannan, and would have thrown Hamlet a little bit for a loop. One of the central dilemmas of Hamlet is, you know, he's off doing his to be or not to be speeches and things like that, is what are his own responsibilities in this situation? Like, what does he have to do because, you know, somebody's unjustly killed his father? So this is kind of the core issue of the Hamlet, the whole play of Hamlet, and why he goes off and acts all crazy and does all the nutty things that he does, is whether he's how to prove this and if he should avenge his father or not. What would they say about that? Yeah. Yeah, for them, this is a stupid idea. Why would you go off and try to avenge the death of your father? That should be up to the peers, or very nice, the age mates, right? The people who are around the same generation. Those are the people who should decide this. Hamlet should have nothing to do with this. So they have a lot of fun back and forth about these issues, and finally we get to kind of the interpretations that they have. So Christine, what do the elders have to say about this story? Or what are they telling Bohannan she should do with this story? Yeah, I mean, one of the things they say is like, you've left out some very key genealogical details here. You need to, you know, obviously you've heard it wrong, so go find out. And then you know, and then what do they think about their interpretation?
They're right. They know more than the story is saying that, and they think that they're right.
Yeah, so again, a couple great quotes. I love this one because it's kind of exactly what Bohannan thought when she went to the field. And they're like, hey, look, sure, you guys wear different clothes and your customs are different and your marriage patterns are different and maybe you have different weapons, but people are the same everywhere. We understand them. You know, human nature is the same everywhere. At the time that she's kind of reeling from their differences of interpretation. And then, yes, as Christine tells us, that when the end quotes, and sometimes you must tell us more stories of your country. We who are the elders will instruct you in their true meaning. And some of you notice, and I think it's true, that Delaney, I mean, Delaney's the one who I thought noticed. Well, what is Delaney? What does she feel about these interpretations, or what made you kind of worried about Bohannan here, mad at her?
What I was feeling about her throughout while reading this, but it felt a little not entitled. Maybe that's not the right way to put it, but it felt like she was living in this society and they had to work around her, and they did that out of the sympathy of her, and then she's getting upset when she tries to be obnoxious. I thought that was good, but obnoxious, I guess. But
I think that yeah, entitled. That's a, you know,
right word.
it may not be, but it might be. I used to assign a longer, what she called an anthropological novel to her to classes called Return to Laughter. She was kind of obsessed with Shakespearean imagery, and she might be a little bit, or at least her character that she presents the anthropologist as might be a bit entitled. I think that there is others have interpreted this as that there is a kind of fatal flaw in this story, is that she does not take their interpretation seriously. She isn't listening to them. And, Yeah, it would be nice. It would be nice if they actually had more of an equality of exchange, but the inequality of exchange is preserved. So there's that. That is true. So as for Bohannan, I think there's some key lessons. And I think one of the reasons I still like this article, despite its flaws, is that it itself opens up to multiple interpretations. I think what Bohannan is trying to say is that the differences that she found were much more than she expected. The whole idea that human nature is the same the whole world over does not seem to be playing out. And that cultural relativism, which we've talked about as trying to understand people from their own point of view and within their own society, is much more difficult than it can sometimes seem. So it's easy to kind of pronounce this from sitting in a classroom or somewhere. It's another to try and do this outside when you are living in another group. And Bohannan had to they were difficult times in terms of the physical sacrifices you had to make to do field work in a different place. Of course, their own belief in this universality, or their what we might say is a disbelief in what Bohannan believes is a deep difference. So at the one time, she's discovering that human nature is not really the same the whole world over, while they're telling her, hey, wait, humans are the same the whole world over. And also, and this is leading us into our language chapter that we'll be reading over the next two classes, linguistic anthropological issues, so issues about language and how we translate terms and how we understand that our language is not just a way of naming things in the world, but it's a whole set of meanings about how we apprehend and perceive the world itself. So the lack of an idea of a ghost, there are ideas about water, that you can't drown in water because water is good, that only witches can make someone mad or crazy. So there's these ideas that are fundamentally different and shape how people move and act in the world. As I said, I think there's also, in some ways, I think Bohannan wrote this mostly to talk about cultural differences, but we could also read it about things that we share or have in common. So Ariana, you saw it as kind of something that people share, which is what do we all do often?
That we use to a big thing in this culture is many things that pass down to generation to generation. It's not just discovered and then left.
Yeah, and we often pass that down by sitting around and telling stories and trying to interpret them and trying to think about them. And so in many societies, all societies, people tell stories, tales, and they try to make sense of them. Because humans are essentially, we use symbols as cultural, we are cultural to our core, and so we are engaged in trying to understand and make meaning of the world, even in sort of the world out there that may not make sense. We try to make it make sense, and so we make patterns in the stars and see things in the environment And so we are constantly trying to make sense of the world as meaning makers. We talked about this, that in some ways we share that our own ethnocentric ways of looking at the world, that we believe that our interpretations are the correct ones, and that others are not necessarily misguided. There's also, we could say here that there's a shared sense of that we share a sense of right and wrong, or good and bad, and evaluating people's actions in terms of these terms. But certainly it's also, wow, it can be almost, sometimes what's right and wrong can be almost the opposite in another place, as in, wow, you should not have married that person so quickly. Oh, yes, you should do that because that's the right thing to do. So, like I said, this is a pretty classic article. It's used sometimes outside of anthropology classes. Sometimes people read it in English classes when they're reading some Shakespeare or something. But here we use it to talk about the difficulties of field work, transition into some of the ideas about language, and to speak in general about this idea of culture as shaping our human experience.